Sharon Brous is the senior and founding rabbi of IKAR, a leading edge Jewish community based in Los Angeles. She was named #1 on the Newsweek Daily Beast list of most influential rabbis in America. In 2013, Rabbi Brouse blessed President Obama and Vice President Biden at the inaugural National Prayer Service, returning in 2021 to bless President Biden and Vice President Harris. Rabbi Brouse has also led the 2021 White House Passover Seder and the 2023 Hanukkah candle lighting with the Vice President and Second Gentleman. In 2016, her TED Talk, Reclaiming Religion, has now been viewed by more than 1.5 million people. Rabbi Brouse is the author of the new book, The Amen Effect, Ancient Wisdom to Heal Our Hearts and Mend Our Broken World. Amy E. Schwartz is Moment Magazine's opinion and book editor, as well as editor of the magazine's popular Ask the Rabbi section. Before coming to Moment, Amy was a longtime editorial writer and op-ed columnist at the Washington Post, where she was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in commentary. Amy is president of the Non-Denominational Jewish Studies Center in Washington, D.C., and is the editor of the book, Can Robots Be Jewish? And Other Pressing Questions of Modern Life. Please welcome Rabbi Sharon Brous and Amy E. Schwartz.
Well, let me start by saying it's a wonderful book. I enjoyed it a lot, and it's very thought-provoking. I just have to ask parenthetically, do people say to you the amen effect all the time?
It depends who. It depends who. For usually Jews say the amen effect, and Christians say the amen effect, and some people say the amin effect, and so that, as it is said in by Muslims, and so it sort of depends who you're talking to. But I've noticed that when I say the amen effect, people can't really process it the same way as when I say amen. So
Somehow that's what's in the culture. Yeah.
somehow, yes.
I want to talk also about sort of your whole career and all the when I first started hearing about you, mostly from people I've known since college, a lot of very high-powered people. You seem to have got behind this congregation, and I think it's the way Judaism works for them at the moment we're living in.
Yeah.
Is IKAR an acronym?
It's not an acronym. It means the root or the essence or the heart of the matter. And when we were building the community, we were really trying. It was 20 years ago, and it was a time of so much unrest and conflict in the world. And I just felt like I really want to focus on the heart of the matter. What does Judaism teach us? What is our sacred inheritance in the world? And how do we not get distracted by a lot of the kind of petty quarrels that are going on between communities and between denominations, and instead really focus on what's most important? What does it mean to be a Jew and a human being in the world right now?
And did you have an elevator pitch length answer for that? Did people say to you, "Well, what is the root?" If you say we're getting back to the root, what's the root?
Well, I'll tell you, the closest to an elevator pitch that we had was I realized that the core question that was keeping me up at night was, how can we mine our Jewish inheritance to live lives of meaning and purpose? And so we wanted to build a religious and spiritual experience that would be dynamic and vibrant and joyful and personal, and a place where people could cry and dance and sing. And we also wanted to speak to the great moral questions of our time. Really, what does a Jew do alive in the world when the war in Iraq is unfolding, the war in Afghanistan, when there's disease and poverty and racism? How are we called to act in this time? So the community attracted from the beginning almost entirely people in their 20s and 30s and early 40s. That was the founder community. At some point, it became a multi-generational community, which is when I think it got really interesting because our parents joined the community because they were so excited that their kids were having a meaningful Jewish experience. And so they also came in. And then a lot of those young people had children. So all of a sudden we had this beautiful multi-generational dynamic. And what was so interesting was that the community did not segment off by demographic, really. I mean, there were certainly times when the 20-somethings want to be with the 20-somethings and the boomers want to be with the boomers. But generally at Shabbat lunch every single week, and we always have Shabbat lunch together after every service, you'll see a real multi-generational mix at every single table in the room.
That's a very simple prescription that sounds like it might be also partly the root. Just if everyone has lunch together, is that a
Yeah.
sit down lunch or a big kiddish or
We have
um,
a sit down lunch. I mean, it's a giant kiddish
wow.
that turns into a sit down lunch, and people stay for hours. I mean, literally hours. So the two questions that we were really asking, and I actually wrote about it a little bit in the intro to the book, but the two questions were, how can we excavate our inheritance to live lives of meaning and purpose as Jews? And two, what does it mean to be a Jew in a time of moral crisis? And I think somewhere at the intersection of those two, the community was really born. So we were hungry for Jewish community and connection and ritual. I mean, the
Mm,
people who were coming were almost entirely unaffiliated Jews, pretty disconnected from Jewish life, but had a real yearning for spiritual connection, for community connection, and really wanted to try to figure out what the moral imperative was that we were holding, that was going to be our North Star during these difficult times.
It's interesting. That was you that anticipated my question, which obviously it's logical. Is I was wondering what people came to you with. You know, did they came? You said they were unaffiliated. They were looking for something. Did they bring a a knowledge of Jewish heritage or memories of grandparents? Or I'm also it's interesting that their parents were in town available to join the congregation. That's
Somewhere. Yeah,
right.
I mean, it was so it's a pretty there was a pretty big variety of folks, but we did do a demographic study early on at IKAR because a lot of people were asking us, who are these people? Where do they come from? Like, what's driving them? The same question you just asked. And what we found in the demographic study was that 75% of the people coming to IKAR were unaffiliated Jews. They were disaffected, young, but they had all grown up with some positive Jewish experience in their lives that rooted them. So either a Passover Seder tradition in their family, or they went to Jewish camp and they remember Kabbalat Shabbat by the lake when everybody looked so beautiful and they kissed the boy for the first time, or
Right.
some like beautiful relationship with a Jewish grandparent and sense of connection to their history and family in that way. That was about 75%. And then there was about 10% who were totally considered themselves totally marginal to the Jewish communal experience, had never had that positive Jewish experience before, but were really just curious and wanted to try to find something that would be meaningful. About 10% or so that came from other communities that sort of found their way to IKAR because they were looking for a more vibrant davening culture, prayer culture. And then a small percentage of people that were rabbis and Talmud professors and people who said that they could really only pray when they were in Jerusalem in the summer, studying because they love that incredibly, powerful Jerusalem prayer experience and didn't feel like they could really translate it here. And so it was really a mix of mostly unaffiliated, but with some kind of connection, and then some totally disconnected and some hyper connected. And
Right.
what was interesting was the religious practice has always been very diverse at IKAR. So we have a lot of rabbis and rabbinical students and Talmud professors and Jewish history professors, etc. So we have people who are very observant in a traditional way. And then we have a lot of people who really are, will eat their bacon maple donut on their way into their car to get to services on Shabbat morning. And what's great is it's a truly non-judgmental community. And so those folks rarely in Jewish life will those people have an opportunity to interact with one another in religious settings, and they do at IKAR, and the most wonderful things happen when they do. So really unlikely relationships and a lot of creative thinking and ideas have grown out of this interesting mix of folks who connect to the community.
And what's the prayer? How do all these different people come together to pray? Is it a lot of conversation or?
We worked really hard to build a prayer culture that would be radically inclusive and warm and joyous and honest. And part of the way that we get there is through the music. We have this incredible Chazan, Hillel Tigay, who was not trained traditionally as a Chazan. He is a rabbi's kid. His father is Rabbi Jeff Tigay. And he grew up in synagogue and he knows every nusach, to every obscure, piece of liturgy. But he really came out to LA to be a rock star. And so he has this really eclectic, interesting musical palette. And I just so resonated to the way that he approached the idea of prayer. And basically, we built a davening team with Hillel and with someone named Ross Levinson, we call him the beat at IKAR because he's our lead drummer. And he's kind of he's in some ways like the soul of the music. And this beautiful team, we built what we call a davening team, which is a group of people, and we're all in the prayer together. And I would say to the team regularly, what is the music that makes you need to pull over your car so that you can cry? And I want that sound and that level of depth and emotional intensity in our services. And combining that ethos with Hillel's incredible kind of complex, magnificent musical mind, created for us this really beautiful blend. And what it does is it actually welcomes in people, even though all of the prayers are pretty traditional. We do a very full traditional prayer service, but the music is so different that people are caught off guard a little bit. And they're like, wait a second, what is that? What's happening here? And it makes them feel welcome in this space. We also, the way that we talk about God is designed to be very inclusive to people who have lots of different conceptions of what God is or could be or is not. And we have a lot of people who are avowed atheists who are in the community, and they are praying right next to the people who are the most faithful. And it's really beautiful and very rich. And ultimately, and this I get to a little bit in the book, when I'm talking about Mourner's Kaddish, I really see prayer as a way not only to connect with the Holy One, but also to connect with each other. And so much of the feeling of prayer at IKAR is about helping people express the yearning in their hearts and then have others just bear witness to it, see it, be present to it, and say amen. And so that is a very kind of welcoming, universal, accessible way to engage prayer. So even though all of the prayers are in Hebrew, and even though we're doing a full Musaf on Rosh Hashanah, and it's that takes a very long time, still people feel like they can get a foothold in this service and they can connect, because so much of it is about drawing out whatever lives at the depths of our hearts, but needs to be lifted up in community.
That's so interesting. Well, you mentioned the Mourner's Kaddish, and I want to go back a little bit and talk about grief, because in a lot of ways in the book, and in a lot of what you said when I heard you speak in Washington last week, it seems as if grief is, funerals and mourning and grief, they play a big part in the book. And it seems as if grief is kind of a starting point for a lot for in terms of understanding what people need from religion, and maybe understanding religion itself. Is that right? Is that one of the places you start?
For some it is. And I want to say that the book is not a grief book, but there is a lot of heartache in the book. And
there are a lot of funerals in the book. Yeah.
A lot of funerals. There are a lot of funerals. And because I think that at these threshold moments of life and death is when I, as a rabbi, learn the most about the human heart and the human experience. And I do think that it is in moments of loss, that is one of the moments that people are looking for spiritual anchor. Even people who think as they go through life that they don't need such things end up turning often to religion in those moments. And so there is an opportunity in moments of grief to find meaning and to find connection with other people. So some of the reason that the grief rituals are so prominent in the book is because I think it really is one of the things that Jews do best. I think we do a few things really well. I think we do grief really well, and we do comedy really well, and we do bagels really well. I mean, we understand the schmear. We understand a few things about life and death.
Mm,
But really, what I found in my experience walking through the valley of the shadow of death with many, many people now in the last 20 years is that when people are hurting most, we really have this really innate human desire to be a part of something, something real and substantial and older than us, something
mm,
older and wiser than we are. People don't want to have to make a lot of decisions after experiencing a terrible loss. We want there to be some ancient wisdom that says the tradition is we bury as soon as possible. The tradition is we'll stay in the house of mourning for 7 days. That's what we
mm,
do. Instead of saying to someone, I don't know, how long do you feel like grieving for? It could be 3 days, it could be 2 weeks. It helps a lot to say there's some structure that has been honed over the course
mm,
of thousands of years that helps us understand how to hold some of these most difficult moments. And of course, it's not right for everybody. It doesn't fit exactly right, and it doesn't have to. But the idea is that there is some formulation that is very time worn. The words of the mourner's Kaddish, which when a mourner says them, she knows I am now saying words that my ancestors said, that I don't know even the names of my great 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 grandparents, but I know that they probably said mourner's Kaddish
mm,
when their loved ones died. And there's something so powerful and timeless about that. And so I really look to the grief rituals as a very powerful um, way of understanding the human heart and also understanding our tradition and what it means for an individual to be in relationship with an age-old tradition and still find
mm,
room for individual expression, even in the midst of a very ancient structure.
mm. And of course, people who are bereaved are usually doing it. They're not familiar with it. You're familiar with it, but they haven't done it before. They're doing it either the first or the second time or whatever.
Right. I mean, it just depends on who the people are and how close they are to community and how far away they are. And in a community that is predominantly formerly unaffiliated people, it's true. I mean, a lot of the time that people are encountering Shiva for the first time, it's when it's their own.
Hmm.
And so a big piece of the Amen effect for me, when it started off as just a sermon, was essentially saying to people that the very heart of life was actually showing up in those moments of greatest
Mm,
heartache for one another, finding our way to each other, and that it truly matters if you show up at Shiva or if you decide to sit it out. And Amy, you and I can both attest to this, I'm sure, from our own lives, but in those moments of greatest challenge and of greatest joy, we remember who was there and we remember who was not there, right?
yeah, yeah.
Because it just matters in ways that I think we try to downplay. We don't, we try not to think about, because we would rather stay away, because there's so many good reasons why people stay away when others in our community or even loved ones are hurting. We feel destabilized by their vulnerability. We feel like we're not needed there and we're going to be imposing on them if we show up. We feel like we're going to say the wrong words and we're going to end up hurting them even more. We have really good reasons for doing it, but ultimately the tradition says just show up, just go to the funeral, just go to the Shiva, just get to the wedding, just
Mhm,
get to the bat mitzvah, right? These critical moments of life and death and liminal moments of transition, they really matter. And when we pay attention to those, what starts shifting is all the in-between moments too.
mm,
Because once we train our hearts to actually show up at the Shiva, then we also are well prepared to call each other and do the check-in just because it's Friday. And
mm,
I shared in the book this little story about something I found out many, many years after it started happening. But there was a terrible, tragic death in our community. And a mother lost her son on a Friday. And I found out many years later that another beloved couple in the community, just knowing how hard Fridays would be for her, just picked up the phone and called her the next Friday, and then the next Friday, and the next Friday. And now they have a multi-year practice of speaking every single Friday, sometimes for 30 seconds, sometimes for 15 minutes, But she knows, this bereaved mother, that she can count on this phone call from these friends. And it's turned into this most beloved, beautiful relationship because she ends up helping them through a really hard time that they have a couple of years later. And it becomes this really beautiful reciprocal gift of healing that they're able to give one another because they just simply show up. And Friday is not the funeral. It's not the yard site even. It's just Friday. But the in-between moments are we're oriented toward those because we have learned to train our hearts toward the bigger moments.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about this tendency of people to not show up, all these reasons not to show up, is that, I feel like I'm hearing you make a broader social criticism about, is it not just about the Shiva, but are we living in a world where it's hard to make yourself show up to things where we don't value that?
Yeah, we are. I mean, part of the reason I wrote this book is because we are in crisis. We're in crisis as individuals and we're in crisis as a society. It's a crisis of loneliness. It's a crisis of social alienation and isolation, one from the other, that predated COVID, but was absolutely exacerbated by COVID. It's a crisis of political polarization and ideological extremism. And these things are all connected to each other because what happens is our spirits are breaking. People are literally dying from loneliness and from hopelessness right now. They're dying from disconnection. And our democracy is dying for much of the same reason. And I write in chapter 8 about Hannah Arendt, who writes that loneliness and social disconnection are a precondition for tyranny. That conspiracy theories and tyrannical regimes cannot attain power in a society in which people know each other and trust each other and have relational connections to one another. So the more disconnected we are, not only the more do our own hearts break and do our communities break. And we see the whole, the decline of the church, the decline of the synagogue. People are less affiliated than ever before. But also we see that wedges are able to be driven into our movements for social justice, for example. And if people don't know each other in our society, then they can't say, wait a minute, the thing that you're telling me about that people, that doesn't speak for my friend who's in that group. And so part of this is a really urgent call that we have got to learn how to see one another precisely in a time when we are instinctively drawn to retreat from one another, especially in pain, especially in sorrow. Our instinct is to pull away, but instead we have to learn how to lean in and turn toward.
And you talk in the book about being the experience of being a rabbi through COVID and all this loneliness, all this isolation. Are we old enough for you have been? Were you also a rabbi during the AIDS crisis, the epidemic at all?
I became a rabbi in 2001 and we started IKAR in 2003. So yes, I mean, yes and no. The peak of the AIDS crisis in the late 90s, I was still in rabbinical school. But for me, actually, one of the transformative moments in my thinking about what role Judaism could play in the world and what role it could play in each of our lives was actually something that's not in the book. But when I went to B'nai Jeshurun in the early 90s, and I heard Rabbi Marshall Meyer preaching about HIV/AIDS and talking about how homophobia, how fear and hatred were transforming this moment such that HIV/AIDS would become a global pandemic. And he said, mark my words, tens of millions of young people are going to die in this country and around the world unless we step forward and say we're not going to stand for it. And I remember that I heard that in synagogue at Friday night services. I was so shocked. I just thought, my God, that's what Judaism is. It is a moral call to honor the dignity of every single human being and to see the social trends of dehumanization and to recognize that we all have a role in working to save and protect and ultimately transform our society so that human dignity can actually be real.
That's very interesting. That was, I mean, this might seem like a weird question, but why do you think Jews are good at this? I mean, here we are. I mean, the small people that's always clung tight together under all these external forces. Um, why would our practices be so powerful in combating this, kind of spread out isolation? I
Hmm.
mean,
Well, first, I see in our tradition an attentiveness from even thousands of years ago. I mean, really from the Torah. So,
mm,
from the inception of our tradition, but then throughout the rabbinic text, an understanding that human beings are fundamentally relational beings.
mm,
And this is
mm,
something that biologists and psychologists and neuroscientists and clergy and social psychologists all agree on, that we fundamentally need each other. And I speak in the book about, in the chapter on loneliness, about how in the midst of creation, after the end of every day, God says it was good, it was good, it was very good. And the first thing that's not good is, it says in the Torah, in the beginning of Genesis, Lo tov hiyot adam levado. It's not good for a person to be alone.
mm,
And therefore, it says that God decides to create for Adam Harishon, for the first person, and Ezer Kenegdo, a helpmate, we translate it as, but someone to help Adam, this person, by sitting opposite him and seeing him
mm,
and loving him and supporting him and caring for him, but also challenging him and
mm,
pushing him to be the best version of himself. And so what ends up happening, the rabbis really teach us, this is not a call to get married. This is a call to root yourself in relationships of care and concern and trust and shared purpose.
mm,
And those relationships are so central to Jewish practice that we can't even grieve without having 9 other people there to say amen to our pain. We can't get married without witnesses. We need people to say, I see you in your joy. I see you in your sorrow. And so I think that our rabbis, our tradition and our rabbis really understood that as relational beings, we can't really experience the fullness of life alone, but we
mm,
can experience the fullness of life only in relationship with other human beings. And so we are, part of our work is to root ourselves in those kinds of communities, and if they don't exist, to try to build them. And by the way, I mean, during COVID, all kinds of bizarre things happened. There definitely were some silver linings from this very difficult time. One of them was that we started broadcasting our services, which is something I
mm,
never wanted to do before. Though many people asked, and kept saying, no, you can't capture the experience of Shabbat morning anyway. So we started to have daily minyan and Shabbat services, everything live stream. And we one day got a message from this Jewish man who lived in Alaska. And he said he was like something like 90 miles away from the next Jew. And he was so lonely, but someone pointed him to our live stream. And he said, for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm part of a Jewish community now. And so even when we're in isolation physically, we can still root in community by connecting, thank God, through this technology, which is responsible for so much of the, the decline of democracy, and also of our mental and spiritual wellness, but also the benefit of these machines and social media is that we also can find our way to one another through them.
Did IKAR continue daily minyan on Zoom?
Yeah, and it's very powerful. I mean, we literally have people from all over the country and all over the world. We have community members who live in Tokyo, and they are with us for every single minyan, for every teaching that we do, every lunch and learn, even in the middle of the night over
Yeah, I'm
there.
gonna say they're staying up awfully late.
It's quite remarkable. They're really
Huh.
committed because we are their Jewish community. And at some point, they really wanted to meet their best friends who they see every single day. And so they flew in from Tokyo and they got a hero's welcome when they came to IKAR. And it was so wonderful. Because everybody knows them through the screen and when we're actually able to see them. But I will say we have we have members now from all over the world who are actually members of the community. And Amy, to your point about, about the, like, this need for connection and how Jews need this, and um we started to offer this membership category of IKAR from afar when COVID came. And the fact is, it did not give people anything different from what they could get for free online.
Oh,
And
that's funny.
hundreds and hundreds of people started joining IKAR from afar. They were paying for a free service. And so I kept asking them, we would do these new member house parties so I could meet people and connect with them. And I said, why are you doing this? It's free. And they said, because we want to be in relationship with you and with each other. We want to be in relationship. Like, people were hungry to find their way to each other meaningfully. And that is a consistent, I have found that consistently throughout my years in the rabbinate, that what people yearn for, maybe more than anything else, is to be seen by another person or by other people, to actually be seen, to have someone say amen when they're grieving, to have someone say mazel tov when they're celebrating. That's such a powerful human need that we can actually give to one another.
Well, you mention in the book, when you're talking about the Ezer Kenegdo and the creation of the helpmate, you reference this, I guess, a mystical, or maybe it's a midrash, that the original human being, who is of both genders, the Adam, actually is a combined being that has two faces, but they can't see each other because they're stuck back to back. I thought that was very that is an interesting image, that it's not enough to be one being, that you have to be able to turn around and look each other in the face.
And I love that the rabbis imagined that they imagined that even though they had everything they could ever need in one body, they couldn't see each other, and they needed to sit opposite each other so that they could encounter one another in that way. And right after that midrash, I share another midrash that I've always loved, that touches me so deeply, which is at the end of the sixth day of creation, which is, of course, the first day that human beings are created. When night starts to fall, Adam becomes so scared because he's never seen nighttime before. And as the sky darkens, he gets, with an increasing intensity, really terrified, and he's screaming and he's thrashing around and he's saying, what have I done? Did I cause the end of the earth? And Eve, Chava, just comes over and sits down across from him. Keneged lo is the language of the Midrash, the same, echoing the language from the Torah, and just sits across from him and holds him, and they weep together throughout the night. And so the question that I ask in the book is, who will weep with you through the night? Not who will fix you, not who will light the way for you when you're in the darkness, but who will sit with you in the darkness and just be with you, so that you don't have to be alone as you're dealing with whatever the darkness is that enters your life. And that, I believe, really is a core question for all of us to grapple with in our lives.
I noticed in the event that I went to, but also it sounds like you do this regularly on your book tour, very strikingly, at the end of a book talk, you you ask people to join you in your own mourner's cottage, right? Can you talk about that? How you added your own bereavement into the book tour in a way, or embraced it?
Yeah. I mean, so I wrote this book and closed the manuscript over a year ago, and the book comes out in a different world than the book I wrote it for. And I'm different than when I wrote this book, and I'm so relieved. I'm so relieved that the book still stands. This is not a book that's written for a particular moment in time. And yet, in many ways, it feels more apt for this moment than for the moment I wrote it for, in many ways. But one of them is that I really wrote, well, Amy, let me take a step back first, and we haven't actually talked about the Mishnah yet. And the Mishnah is the central paradigm of the book. It's a fairly obscure Mishnah. It is one that I've never heard anyone else teach before. So we have our greatest hits Mishnayot. This is not one of them. but I
Go
felt like
back, and so a Mishnah
okay,
is
so
a
a
piece of
Mishnah
oral
is
Torah, right? Yeah,
yes, is
yeah.
the Oral Torah, which was codified around the year 220 CE. This is a Jewish legal compendium, very old, and this is one of the most extraordinary texts because it describes the ritual in which Jews would come from all around the land and also from the diaspora. They would ascend to Jerusalem, ascend the steps of the temple. They would turn to the right as they entered the temple courtyard and circle around the perimeter of the courtyard and then exit essentially right where they had entered, except for somebody who was to whom something terrible had happened. That person would ascend to Jerusalem, ascend the steps, turn to the left in the opposite direction, and walk against the current. And every single person that they would pass would have to stop and look at them and say, Ma lach, what happened to you? Tell me your story. Why does your heart hurt? And they would answer saying, I am bereaved. I have lost my loved one. I'm sick. I'm worried about my child. I just feel so lonely. I don't know what I'm doing with my life, etc., etc. And the people who are all going from the right would have to offer them a blessing. And that is the ritual that would take place again and again and again in this pilgrimage that people would take to the Temple Mount. So when I encountered this text, when I came to understand it, which was not the first time I encountered it, because when I first encountered it, I really hadn't lived enough life, I don't think, to understand it yet. But then I had some babies. I had some pregnancy losses. I officiated a lot of weddings. I officiated a number of divorces. I buried a lot of people. I found the text again, and I really understood it in my core. And what I understood that it was saying was that this is our core responsibility, is to actually see one another precisely at the moment that neither party wants to see the other. So the people who enter and are turning to the left, in my experience working with the bereaved, the last thing you really want to do when you've suffered a loss, especially a tragic or traumatic loss, is like put on your clothes and show up at the big event where there are going to be tons and tons of people. And yet the text says you have to show up. And when you get there, you can't pretend you're okay. You don't turn to the right like everyone else. You have to walk against the grain. And so too, the people who are coming from the right, who are having this peak spiritual moment of their lives, they're on pilgrimage. They're hundreds of thousands of people. They're in this flow of humanity. The last thing they want to do is see the broken person who's ambling toward them, but they have to. And they have to stop and really see them and ask them what's happened to you and listen to their answer and offer them a blessing. And I realized that this is the greatest gift that we could actually give one another, is to be able to root our suffering in a context of care and to build context of care that can then hold all of us in our suffering. And all of that said, I really wrote the book as someone who is trained to turn to the right and walk counterclockwise, because it's my job and because it's my nature. And because I had been really blessed, honestly, to not have been a mourner for an immediate family member yet throughout my life. I had certainly experienced losses, but I had not experienced yet the death of an immediate family member. And so I was used to walking from the right and taking care of people. And then I closed the manuscript, and my father died right before High Holy Days this year. I spoke about it on Rosh Hashanah, actually. And all of a sudden, I was turning to the left, and I was using a different set of muscles than I had ever used before. And then October 7th happened, and I felt like our whole Jewish community, in some ways, which had been oriented to walk to the right, and as a community of relative privilege and safety in America, had been trained to look around and say, who can I ally with? Who am I called into allyship with?
Who can I help?
Who can I help right now?
Yeah.
Instead, many of us felt like we were turning to the left, saying, hey, we need someone to see our pain. Can anyone see what's happened to our hearts? And so I realized as I walked into the recording booth to record the audiobook in November, and I worried about the manuscript. Like, would it hold up? Because I wrote it for a different time. And I realized that the wisdom of the book is ancient wisdom, that it holds up because the rabbis were talking about the human heart and the human condition. And that has not changed over thousands of years. We are broken and we are called to hold those who are broken. We are both of those things, all of us, in the course of our lifetime. And so, yes, so since my father died and I'm saying mourner's Kaddish every day, I realized that I'm going out on a book tour, and it's not always easy to join a minyan where I can say Kaddish when I'm out on the road. And I realized, well, right in this room, there are no doubt, 9 other people in this room who can say Amen to my Kaddish. And even more than that, since I started this book tour for the last 2 weeks, I have not once been in a room where I'm the only mourner. And that really is a powerful reminder that we have no idea what people are holding in any room that we're in. And so I will often ask people at the end of my talk to please stand with me if they're also in mourning, and share the person who they're remembering, either a yard site, an anniversary of a death, or if they're mourning for a beloved family member or friend. And the way that we practice this at IKAR is a little bit different from the practice. And I know in some Orthodox and many Reform communities, everybody stands for Mourner's Kaddish as a way of being in solidarity with the people who are speaking. But for us, and we're not the only ones who do it this way, but I really love practicing it this way. I ask everybody to be seated except for the mourners. And it takes a lot of courage to stand up, especially when you've just experienced something painful. But I want the community to see who the mourners are so that we know who to approach after services at Kiddush and say, hey, tell me about your father. Tell me about your husband or wife. Like, I want to know why your heart hurts. Malach, tell me what happened to you. And so I've been doing this practice now at all of my book talks, and it's actually so powerful and meaningful for me, and I know for others, because even those who are not saying Kaddish, and even those who are not Jewish and who have never heard this practice before, I invite them to just join me in the practice of saying Amen, 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 to actually working the muscle of responsiveness to one another's pain.
Just being there. Yeah. It adds a very interesting, profound dimension to a book talk or any kind of, public gathering. That's really interesting. My kids had a preschool teacher who said that the best translation for amen was right on, which I think was, it
Yeah.
worked for the little kids, but kind of works.
But it's also right. I mean, it comes from the Hebrew people. The rabbis attach it to the Hebrew word emunah, which is the word for faith. And I often think of it as a person expressing faith in another person. I
Uh,
believe you. I hear
hmm
you in your pain.
yeah,
Amen. I
what he
have faith
said.
in you. And so we think about faith as vertical, but it's also horizontal. It's
hmm
also an expression of connection and compassion and trust and care with another human being.
hmm Yeah. Let me ask you. I hope we have time for another question. Um, I wanted to take a step back and look at sort of outside of your congregation and what, the slice that we're talking about, that you're seeing. I mean, I have this growing stack of books on my desk that I think of as sort of talking about the you might call it the gentler Judaism, the less rules-based Judaism, the more open to the world kind of Judaism without tears, or there's various different takes on it. Do you see that generally as something that's happening with American Jews? I mean, that is this and if so, why is that? I know there was a time, 150 years ago when people moved off of sort of Orthodox uh, rule, completely halacha oriented Judaism, and went, looked for something more love and emotion and community based. Is this? I mean, what's going on now with that? I mean,
I think that people are hungry for connection.
Mhm,
They want to connect with the tradition. They want to connect with ritual. They might even want to connect with God, and they certainly want to connect with each other.
mhm,
And for many people, they can't find an access point in traditional Jewish observance because it's not designed to be accessible, even to people
mhm,
who come from within the tradition. It is not designed to be there. There's no easy entry. And when we started to build IKAR, considering this this challenge, what we determined was ultimately we wanted to, as one person put it, a few months after we built IKAR, to lower the barrier for entry and to raise the bar for engagement.
Mm.
So in some ways to make it, to give people a way to actually access the tradition. So for example, Sarah Hurwitz's book does a great job of this, where she just describes the journey of being a 30 something Jew, very prominent speechwriter, very politically connected, but pretty disengaged from her Jewish life, and going on this journey to try to access meaning in our tradition. And then her book itself becomes a gateway for other people who are trying to access it. So I think that if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think that this literature that's starting to emerge is trying to create a language for engaging a very old tradition that seems from the outside to be impenetrable. And the outside is not necessarily non-Jews. The outside could be Jews ourselves. And I say that as someone who grew up with a very strong Jewish identity and sense of connection to my Jewish family, and to Shabbat even, but who felt like an outsider in almost every Jewish space I entered, because I did not know the rules, because I did not know how to figure out what page we were on when I walked into services late, because I never knew when to stand up or sit down. I never knew when to speak and when to be silent. And so I myself felt like there was this impenetrable box that I actually imagined envisioning that there was the most wonderful party that was happening in a house, and someone forgot to invite me, but I knew that I belonged there, and I kept knocking and knocking, but no one was opening the door. And I literally envisioned this for years, that I'd
Wow.
walk around the house trying to find, maybe someone left a window open. Could I sneak in?
Huh.
And, just trying to find my way into my own party. And so I think that some of this literature is an attempt to actually give points of access, not to dumb it down and
Right.
not to numb it down, but actually to say, this beautiful tradition is yours, and here's how you can find a point of access. I will also just lift up the name of David Steindl-Rast, who's a Benedictine monk, who for me was a great teacher in trying to understand what had happened to Jewish life. He's not speaking specifically to Judaism, but he says the following: that every religious tradition begins with some kind of magical, mysterious, mystical burst of insight. And it's like a volcanic eruption. And then the lava starts to pour down the mountainside and eventually settles at the base around the mountain. And then some time passes, maybe 100 years or 200. At some point, somebody who's walking by the base of that mountain just sees cold, dead, black rock and has no idea that that rock used to be fire. And
Mm.
so he says the work of a religious practitioner today is to chip away at the rock in order to recover the fire that's at the heart of it all. And I remember learning this text just years and years ago, just as we were starting to set out to build IKAR. And I thought, that's exactly what we're trying to do. We are engaged in a sacred excavation project where we are trying to reclaim the power of the tradition, which to many people, frankly, appears to be cold, dead, black rock, and they have no idea what's inside and how it could help transform their lives. Thus, the first part of the two-part mission of early IKAR, which was, how can we mine our Jewish inheritance to live lives of meaning and purpose? What lives here in this Siddur of so many pages of prayers and words and words and words that most of our people can't even read? What is there that could actually enhance my life and help me get in deeper touch with the Holy One and with my community and with my tradition? What rituals are there that could help me live a more meaningful life, especially in really hard times?
Wow. Wow. That's a very powerful metaphor.
Yeah.
Since we're almost at the end of the hour, and I wonder if, just as a final question, I could say, is that why I was very struck in the book that you say your favorite day of the year is Yom Kippur, and is that why? I mean, say,
Oh,
can you? How
it's
does that
just the
connect it
best
all up?
day.
I've happened to feel the same way. So it really
Oh,
caught my
I
attention.
love Yom Kippur. I mean, there are a couple of reasons why. I mean, one of them is really that we are given the chance on Yom Kippur to be completely honest with ourselves, with God, and with one another about our flaws and our failures and our hopes and dreams and aspirations. And that kind of honesty is so rare in our society and in our time. And it ultimately it is the experience of being that honest in community, ultimately, if we do it right, lifts our feet off the ground by the end of the day. And so I had this experience, my first Yom Kippur at IKAR. We built the community, we launched in the spring of 2004. And then July 1st became our first official day where we were going to have regular Shabbat gatherings, but they were only on Friday nights and they were super short and super sexy and tons of young people, really exciting and not hard. I mean, I was saying to people we needed to engage the Hebrew because the Hebrew is a portal to the past. And people were like, okay, we can do that for 45 minutes or an hour. But then all of a sudden, summer turned to fall, and we needed to think about what we were going to do for High Holy Days. And we were going to have this really deep encounter with a very difficult liturgy. And with the ideas of High Holy Days, which are hard for people to get. And so I had this room, our first year of IKAR, with over 400 people in the room, 420 people in the room. Many of them had never had a meaningful Yom Kippur experience in their life. And I said, but people came in very solemn and very serious. And I said, listen, this day is a serious day, but it's not a solemn day. It's not a day of sadness. It's actually a day of celebration. In our tradition, this is when love becomes possible. Yom Kippur is a day of love because people could actually find one another in Yom Kippur because we are our most honest selves. And I don't want us to come in here all weepy and I want us to actually see this as an opportunity to go to the depths and to go to the heights, and through that to actually achieve something different from what we ever thought to be possible. And then I started to sing a nigun, and people got up from their seats and they started to dance. And I have to say, I had never experienced dancing on Yom Kippur. I knew I could touch joy, but never dance. And I was so scared. And I thought, oh my God, this is Yom Kippur. It's like, this is a little too much. It's more than I had asked for. And I tried to slow down the nigun, but I couldn't control the room. And people were just singing and dancing and singing and dancing. And finally, I realized this is where the people are and where I need to go to. And so I just started singing and dancing with everybody. And I thought the community just taught me this powerful lesson about joy, which is it actually can't be contained. And it started the tradition at IKAR that, I mean, we literally dance and weep through the entire 25 hours of Yom Kippur together. And it is the most powerful experience. And by the time Ne'ilah comes at the end of Yom Kippur, we are jumping so high that you feel like the ground is going to give out beneath us. But there's so much ecstatic joy because we have touched the depths together in such an honest way. And so, a long answer to your short question, it is absolutely the best day of the year. And it is because I know that when we do the hard work, we actually can heal. We can begin to heal our hearts, and we can begin to heal our collective, our community, and our society, and ultimately the world.
Wow. Well, thank you. On that note, let's wrap it up.
Yeah.
Rabbi Brouse, thank you so much for talking to me and to us, and I hope we'll talk again.
I hope so
Good
too.
luck in all
Thank
your
you so
endeavors.
much.
And
Okay.
read this book, guys. It's great.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye.